In the blistering heat of the Central Australian desert, a man lies dying in a remote cave. Harold Lassiter is starving, his eyes blinded by sand and sun, scratching final lines into his diary. He had claimed to have found a fortune in gold, a motherlode so rich it could make a nation wealthy. Yet in his last agonizing hours, he would have traded that entire bounty for a single loaf of bread and a cup of water. This is the tragic and tantalizing tale of Lassiter's Reef, a mystery that has haunted the Australian outback for nearly a century. Lassiter's Reef is perhaps Australia's most famous lost treasure legend. The story has all the ingredients of an epic: an outback drifter's claim of an impossibly rich gold deposit, a grand expedition into uncharted desert, and a desperate final journey that cost a man his life. Harold Lassiter perished in 1931 without ever proving his golden find, but his story did not die with him. Instead, the legend of a hidden reef of gold took on a life of its own, luring fortune hunters and sparking debate for decades to come. In 1929, amid the Great Depression, Lassiter came forward with a bold proclamation. Years earlier, he insisted he had discovered a quote-unquote vast gold-bearing reef somewhere in Central Australia. If you can't tell, I'm not an Aussie, but a reef is a vein of valuable minerals or metals. I'm not sure if this is an old-timey word or if it's still popular in Australia these days, so let me know in the comments if you're from the former Habsburg holdings down under. Funny story, just a quick aside, but the confusion between Austria and Australia will never not be funny to me. Years ago, I had a very bizarre dream that was inspired by this mix-up. Let's just say it featured a giant koala in a eucalyptus leaf dirndl, a man who looked suspiciously like the late great Steve Irwin dressed up in lederhosen, and the most surreal waltz ever. But yeah, let's get back on script. Harold wrote to a federal politician describing a huge gold deposit out in the desert, reportedly stretching for miles and incredibly rich in ore. According to this letter, he had found the site around 1911, but lacked the means to develop it at the time. Government officials were dubious, especially when they learned Lassiter had been living on a farm during the period he claimed to be prospecting, and they ultimately dismissed his story. Undeterred by this setback, Lassiter tried again in early 1930. He approached John Bailey of the Australian Workers' Union and spun his tale anew, this time claiming the discovery had actually occurred 33 years earlier, when he was just 17. In this version, Lassiter said his horses had died during a trek across the interior, and that he'd been rescued by a surveyor named Harding, who let him in on a wee golden secret. Such inconsistencies in Lassiter's story raised eyebrows even then. Nevertheless, the lure of a colossal gold strike during hard times proved irresistible. By mid-1930, a syndicate of investors had agreed to fund an expedition to search for Lassiter's Reef. The expedition that set out from Alice Springs in July 1930 was lavishly equipped for its day, complete with motor vehicles and even a small airplane for aerial scouting. The team included seasoned bushman Fred Blakely as leader and Lassiter as guide, along with a handful of other men eager to find the treasure. It wasn't long before reality set in. The desert proved punishing. Trucks bogged in sand and broke down, the airplane crashed, and their radio failed, cutting off contact. As weeks passed with no trace of the gold reef, the crew's confidence in Lassiter plummeted. The guide's behavior grew peculiar. He was sullen and uncooperative, often singing hymns or writing in his diary instead of helping navigate. Eventually, expedition leader Blakely decided that Lassiter's supposed reef was a wild goose chase. Fed up, he accused Lassiter of fraud and elected to quit the search and turn back. By September 1930, the main party had abandoned the mission, effectively stranding Lassiter in the wilderness. Lassiter, however, refused to quit. Determined to find the reef on his own, he joined with a camel handler named Paul Johns and pressed onward into even more remote territory. They trekked through rugged country as Lassiter directed them based on his memory. One day, Lassiter returned to their camp jubilant, showing Johns a chunk of quartz veined with gold, proof, he claimed, that he'd rediscovered the rich reef. But he stubbornly refused to reveal the exact location, which only deepened Johns's suspicions. The two men fell into a heated argument and even came to blows. Finally, Johns, now convinced the reef was nothing but a fantasy, took the remaining camels and left Lassiter behind to fend for himself. Now completely alone with the exception of a couple of single-humped camels, Lassiter pushed onward on foot. Fate dealt one more cruel blow when his last two single-humpers bolted, carrying off most of his supplies. Stranded without food or water, he wandered the desert in dire straits until a group of nomadic Aboriginal people discovered him and shared what little they had. Their kindness kept Lassiter alive for several more weeks. During that time, according to entries later found in his diary, Lassiter claimed to have sighted the gold reef yet again, and even to have pegged a claim on it for his backers. But his physical condition was rapidly worsening, and he was nearly blind, malnourished, and unable to continue on. Harold Lassiter finally succumbed to starvation and exhaustion in late January 1931, alone in the vast emptiness of the interior. When Lassiter failed to return, his backers organized a search party. In March 1931, Bushman Bob Buck found Lassiter's remains near the border of Western Australia and the Northern Territory. Local Aboriginal people had given the dead man a rudimentary burial, laying his body in a shallow grave. This took some time for him to find, and to paraphrase Norm MacDonald, perhaps Buck could have shortened the search by hitting up all the shallow graves first. Buck duly reinterred Lassiter's remains, and later had them moved to a cemetery in Alice Springs. Nearby, Buck found a cave containing Lassiter's personal effects, including his journal and some letters. From these, the final pieces of the story emerged in Lassiter's own words. He described the camels running off, the assistance he received from indigenous companions, and his last futile trek toward civilization. Crucially, Lassiter's diary also asserted that he had indeed found the reef again, and had drawn a rough map to its location, which he hid in his kit bag under a sand dune. Years later, an expedition did dig up that buried kit bag, only to find the map inside had disintegrated to dust. With that, any final clue to the reef's location was lost to the elements. No firm evidence of Lassiter's reef was ever produced, yet the tale only grew in the telling. Over subsequent decades, it attained mythic status, perhaps the greatest lost mine legend in Australia. During the Depression era, the story of a hidden mountain of gold in the outback captured the public's imagination. Popular accounts of the saga made their way to print, and in these retellings the legend grew a bit each time. Some versions of the tale even claim that Lassiter didn't perish at the end, but that he actually ended up fleeing to America. In this version of events, he essentially realized the grift was up and got out, while the getting out was good. However, there's no evidence to prove this was the case, and everything seems to run against it. Harold Lassiter's life story reads more like that of a real-life Captain Ahab, rather than a grifter trying to make a buck. Despite the skeptics, the legend refuses to die, and the tantalizing possibility of a fortune in undiscovered gold continues to beckon adventurers into the desert even today. By some counts, at least a dozen full-on expeditions have tried, and failed, to locate Lassiter's reef over the years. Numerous lesser expeditions have also been carried out as well. Lassiter's own son, Bob, was among those who caught the gold bug fever. Bob Lassiter spent decades mounting some 30 searches of various sizes to redeem his father's name and secure that bag, or reef in this case. Reading Harold's diary had made him a firm believer that the reef was real. He believed his father had been betrayed by the expedition and never given a fair chance to reveal the reef's location. To his dying day, Bob maintained that his father had been telling the truth. The fact that his son was so dedicated to finding the reef as well has led many to believe that Harold was at worst delusional, but not a grifter like some have claimed. But to be fair, Bob Lassiter didn't acquire a case of intergenerational Captain Ahabism from dear old Dad. Rather, he's a guy who just loved his dad and wanted the world to see that his father wasn't some sort of grifter. Today, nearly a century later, the mystery of Lassiter's Reef remains unsolved and as intriguing as ever. No one has confirmed the existence of Harold Lassiter's legendary gold, yet his name is firmly etched into Australia's outback lore. The cave where Lassiter sheltered in his final days now bears a plaque in his memory, and an incredibly desolate 150-mile highway, deep in the outback, bears his name. It began with a pounding on the walls one night. In early April 1921, the Bowen family's small cottage in Guyra, New South Wales, was suddenly under siege by an unseen assailant. Night after night, tremendous thumps rattled the walls, followed by showers of stones clattering onto the roof. Window after window shattered until nearly every pane of glass lay in shards. Nobody managed to catch sight of who, or what, was hurling the rocks. But the attacks seemed especially directed at 12-year-old Minnie Bowen. Stones smashed through Minnie's bedroom window with eerie precision, often landing right on her bed. The frightened family and their neighbors began to whisper that a spirit might be responsible. So began the legend of the Guyra ghost, a mystery that gripped the nation and still haunts Australian folklore. As the bizarre bombardment continued, the once quiet community of Guyra plunged into panic. Suspecting either a ghost or a crafty prowler, dozens of residents had witnessed the phantom stone throwing at the Bowen home and were on edge. Night after night, volunteer watch parties gathered, sometimes as many as 80 people, forming a human wall around the cottage. Their presence did seem to halt the rain of stones on evenings when the crowd stood guard. But to everyone's alarm, the thumping on the walls continued unabated. To those listening outside, the booming knocks sounded as if they came from within the house. To the Bowen family huddled indoors, the bangs seemed to originate just outside the walls. The blows were so powerful they nearly shook the house to its foundations. Fear and tension in Guyra escalated to a dangerous pitch, and most people believed this whole incident was caused by something even more sinister than a poltergeist. Many people began sleeping with loaded guns at the ready to blast any quote-unquote ghost back to the shadow realm, so to speak. This jittery vigilance led to a horrific tragedy. One night, a local woman kept a six-shooter under her pillow for protection, only for her young son to find it and accidentally shoot his sister, though luckily, the girl survived. Even the authorities were feeling the strain. The local police sergeant sat up night after night at the house, sitting amid the incessant disturbances. After days of fruitless stakeouts and sleepless stress, the sergeant finally snapped. He was sent away on leave, exhausted and convinced that something supernatural was at work. In response to the turmoil, the state government dispatched a team of detectives from Sydney to take over the case. The detectives maintained constant guard on the Bowen abode and continued coordinating the volunteer patrols. They even set up powerful floodlights to illuminate the area in hopes of catching the perpetrator. Yet even under these watchful conditions, the ghost, whatever it actually was, refused to be caught. On one occasion, with the yard brightly lit, two large stones struck a wall of the home right beside a policeman, yet no thrower was in sight. The mysterious siege of the Bowen home proved impossible to stop, and by mid-April the story had attracted international attention in the press. Reporters flocked to Gyra, and among the outsiders who arrived was H.J. Moores, an American businessman and friend of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, interested in psychic phenomena. Moores came equipped with cameras and traps, determined to sleuth out a rational explanation, or even better, find proof of a real poltergeist. He was given free rein to investigate the Bowen house. He even removed sections of the roof to create hidden lookout posts in the attic. But the resilient Gyra ghost outsmarted every trap. Pebbles and walnut-sized rocks continued to pepper the walls, and Moores couldn't tell if the projectiles were being thrown from outside or from within the house. After days of fruitless surveillance, Moores conceded that no human prankster was evident, and poltergeist activity was the only explanation he had left. With conventional methods failing, some turned to a spiritual approach. In mid-April, the Bowens invited a psychic, Ben Davy, to see if he could calm the unseen forces. Davy learned that Minnie had an older half-sister, May, who had died just 3 months before the disturbances began. Suspecting a connection, he gently urged Minnie to speak to the presence. Late one night, with Minnie's distraught mother and several officials looking on, Davy prompted the girl to ask the unseen knocker if it was her sister May. To everyone's astonishment, Minnie's timid question was answered by a loud knock from the darkness. Heartened, she continued the one-sided conversation. Before long, Minnie was in tears, claiming she heard May's voice. She related that her sister's spirit was happy in the afterlife, thanked their mother for her prayers, and promised to watch over the family. Strangely enough, after Minnie's emotional attempt to communicate with May, the nocturnal attacks ceased entirely, but only for a short time. For several days, the Bowen household enjoyed quiet, but just as they started to believe the nightmare was over, the phenomena started up again with renewed fury. In late April, as a last resort, Minnie was sent away to live with her grandmother in the town of Glen Innes, about 25 miles from Gyra. If Minnie was truly the focus of the mysterious force, the family hoped, removing her from Gyra would end the haunting. That theory backfired. The poltergeist followed Minnie to her grandmother's house. Almost as soon as she arrived in Glen Innes, the same telltale knocks and stone throwing began plaguing that household. A local police officer who stayed on guard there reported hearing stones pelting the roof and walls while he watched, yet seeing nothing but an empty yard outside. Inside, heavy thuds struck with incredible force. Wherever the hapless girl went, it seemed, the chaotic ghost went with her. After about a week in Glen Innes, Minnie returned home to Gyra. Gradually, the disturbances faded away in the weeks that followed. By early June, the strange siege of the Bowen homestead had ended. In the aftermath, the people of Gyra breathed a sigh of relief, but they were left scratching their heads. Many residents were eager to put the bizarre episode behind them. In later years, locals often downplayed the story or offered far-fetched rationalizations. One local claim was that the stones had all been fired by a giant slingshot from a far-off hill, a theory that never fit the facts but allowed skeptics to laugh the whole thing off. Sometimes the quote-unquote rational theory can make the supernatural theories look totally normal and commonplace, I suppose. Meanwhile, the police were also keen to close the book on the Gyra affair. Under pressure from detectives, Minnie Bowen confessed that on a few occasions she had tossed small stones onto the roof and tapped on a wall to scare a relative. However, She denied responsibility for the vast majority of incidents, and her family never wavered in asserting her innocence. No accomplice was ever identified, and if a real human trickster had been terrorizing the Bowens, that person was never caught. The police declared the mystery solved as a hoax, but plenty of people remained unconvinced. Paranormal researchers, unsurprisingly, had a different view. They noted that the events bore all the classic hallmarks of a poltergeist, a noisy spirit known for tossing objects about and banging walls, typically centered around an adolescent. In their eyes, young Minnie fit the profile of a classic poltergeist focus, a girl on the cusp of puberty unwittingly acting as the catalyst for the chaos. One investigator who studied the case concluded that the Gyra haunting was likely real, with Minnie herself the unwitting source of strange events. The incident's notoriety even inspired a silent film that same year, The Gyra Ghost Mystery, which actually featured Minnie and the rest of the family playing themselves. Weirdly, this film wasn't an early example of the horror genre as you might expect. We don't know exactly what was in the film, since all that survives is the script and some promotional material, but it was actually a comedy, or billed as such at least. This has led some to speculate that the entire family was in on the charade and had done it to gain notoriety and perhaps cash out, while the cashing out was good. Also, just as a quick aside, the brilliant paranormal investigator in the Gyra Ghost Mystery is named Sherlock Doyle. Now, I'm sure I don't have to spell it out for you guys, but Sherlock Holmes was created by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Personally, Sherlock Doyle sounds like someone who would hunt down Arsène Lupin, the gentleman thief, on days when Sherlock Holmes is on vacation. Anyway, putting that aside, if the plan was to parlay a poltergeist hoax into silver screen fame, this didn't work out so well for the Bowen family. The movie was seen by almost no one at the time, and as I mentioned, it was subsequently lost and forgotten. In the dense rainforests of Borneo, tales persist of a secretive striped predator lurking just out of sight. Locals speak in hushed tones of the harimau, a tiger said to stalk the jungles. This isn't some cryptozoological entity cobbled together in modern times, far from it. The harimau is the Borneo tiger, a creature which definitely once existed, and which the locals have great reverence for. Officially, tigers have never been documented in Borneo's modern history. The only wild tigers in Indonesia roam Sumatra today, with extinct subspecies formerly in Java and Bali. Yet on Borneo, indigenous Dayak communities hold memories and rituals invoking a great striped cat, passing down legends that keep the mystery alive. Could a tiger truly prowl this island's dense jungles, or are the contemporary reports based upon long-held cultural memories? To understand the enigma, we first need to consider Borneo's place in Sundaland, the biogeographic grouping of Southeast Asian islands that were once connected. During the Ice Age, lowered sea levels linked Borneo, Java, Sumatra, and the Asian mainland into one landmass, allowing animals to disperse freely. Tigers did populate many parts of this realm. The Indonesian islands of Java and Bali had their own tigers until last century, and Sumatra still has a fragile tiger population today. Borneo, however, seems to be the puzzling exception. The island harbors other large mammals also found in Sumatra: elephants, orangutans, leopards, and rhinos, but no tigers. Clues from the deep past suggest that tigers were indeed part of Borneo's ancient ecosystem. In the mid-20th century, archaeologists excavating Naya Cave in Sarawak uncovered hundreds of thousands of animal bone fragments. Among them was a tiger's wrist bone from a young tiger. Modern dating later revealed this bone to be roughly 13,000 years old. More recent digs have yielded additional evidence. In 2021, scientists reported a partial tiger jaw from another cave, dated to about 22,000 years ago. These fossils confirm that the tiger prowled Bornean forests in the late Pleistocene. However, concrete evidence of any Bornean tiger beyond prehistoric times remains elusive. No tiger remains from the last few thousand years have been conclusively identified, and early European naturalists and explorers never documented live tigers on the island. This lack of historical record suggests that if tigers did linger into the time of human settlement, they disappeared by the time written history and scientific surveys began. Notably, this is somewhat complicated by the fact that the kingdoms and empires that dominated what is now Indonesia prior to the arrival of Europeans were primarily maritime empires. They all knew about tigers and employed tiger imagery, though it's unclear if these were Borneo tigers. The cause of their disappearance is unknown, but what's clear is that by the modern era, tigers were officially absent from Borneo's fauna. Despite the biological blank space, the indigenous peoples of Borneo have rich oral histories and cultural practices involving tigers. Among Dayak communities, the tiger holds a prominent place in folklore, spirituality, and even language. The word for this specific tiger exists in numerous local dialects, such as Haramang in Dayak, and traditional belief systems include Borneo tiger-associated myths. And just to drive the point home, the word Haramang is different from the generalized word for tiger. There's also talk of a creature called Remaung, which is essentially a tiger spirit. Elders would say it was a kind of were-tiger, a spiritual being taking the form of a great cat, which made sense in ancient times when tigers were believed to roam the land. Physical tokens deriving from quote-unquote tiger loot drops are also woven into Dayak traditions. Heirloom artifacts, passed down through generations, sometimes include tiger parts. In one account, a Dayak leader proudly displayed an heirloom sword, decorated with what he asserted were tiger fangs. According to this account, these were orange drops from beasts slain by his ancestors in the Borneo jungles. Over the years, a few other tantalizing claims have surfaced to suggest the Borneo tiger might not be entirely myth. One famous account comes from 1975, when a Belgian adventurer led an expedition into East Kalimantan. The adventurer later claimed he encountered a tiger in the Bornean jungle and even managed to snap 2 photographs as evidence. The grainy photos, when published, appeared to show a tiger according to secondary accounts. And I say secondary accounts here because it doesn't appear that these photographs have ever been published online. That said, all sources agree that this was indeed a tiger, though it was questionable whether the photograph was actually taken in Borneo. From the scientific perspective, the consensus is clear. There is no hard evidence that any tigers live in Borneo today. No skins, no verified tracks, no droppings, no roadkill, no genetic traces, nothing. Biologists claim that if a breeding population of tigers had survived into the present, some tangible sign would likely have turned up by now. The skeptics argue that what locals call a tiger is likely a case of mistaken identity or memory, perhaps conflating the clouded leopard with a true tiger. Notably, these Dayak people have come to view this claim as quite offensive, since their indigenous religious and cultural traditions very clearly refer to tigers. As evidence for this, they and their supporters point out that the clouded leopard also has a role in their traditions, and this role is clearly separate from that of the Borneo tiger. They also casually observe that clouded leopards are relatively small, cute animals with spots, not large, ferocious, striped animals. They further assert that they and their ancestors are and were indeed able to tell the difference between a stripe and a spot. Notably, biologists also puzzle over why Borneo lacks tigers if they once had them. Habitat alone doesn't explain it, as Borneo's dense jungles and ample prey resemble Sumatra's, which supports tigers, and they were all part of one land mass. One hypothesis is that early human hunters or habitat changes thousands of years ago eliminated Borneo's tigers. Yet, intriguingly, some very legitimate researchers urge that we keep an open mind to local knowledge. They point out that Western scientists historically overlooked indigenous reports at times, and sometimes to their detriment. Given the elusive nature of tigers, and given that a small population may be viable, some experts believe that this tiger may be more reality than myth.